15 years of marriage under our belt, and for once, it seemed like we had finally hit that smooth, steady stretch everyone always talked about. Our son, Lucas, who had just turned 15, was turning into a strong, independent young man, always by my side in the garage helping me out, whether we were working on a car engine or fixing up things around the house. He had that sharp wit of his mom, but thankfully, he picked up my love for working with tools and machines. Then there was Mia, my 13-year-old daughter, bright as a firecracker, with just as much spark. She took after Emily in many ways, driven and fiercely independent. But when she wasn't holed up in her room texting her friends or getting ready for cheerleading, she still had that playful, sweet side that reminded me she was still my little girl in a lot of ways. As for Emily, well, she was just as stunning as the day I met her. The kind of woman who could walk into a room and turn heads without even trying. That hadn't changed. She had a great career in marketing at a tech company, something she'd always had a passion for. On the surface, our life seemed about as good as it could get. I climbed out of my truck, grabbing the grocery bags from the passenger seat. As I shut the door, I noticed something odd. Emily's car was already parked in the driveway, and the way it was angled made it look like she'd pulled in quickly. Strange. Lori usually got home after me on weekdays, and she never did anything in a hurry. I pushed open the front door, the familiar scent of lavender air freshener and freshly cleaned floors greeting me as I stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet for a Friday afternoon. "Hey, I'm home," I called out, setting the grocery bags on the counter. No answer. I made my way through the kitchen, past the living room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Lucas was probably at the gym, and Mia was almost certainly hanging out with her friends. But where was Emily? The silence felt off, like something wasn't right. Heading upstairs, I passed by Lucas's room, empty, as expected. Mia's room, as usual, was a mess, clothes scattered everywhere. Typical. When I reached our bedroom, I noticed the door was slightly open. I nudged it a little, and there was Emily, standing by the window with her back to me, her phone in hand. She didn't notice me right away. Her head was down, and she was speaking softly into the phone, her tone hushed, almost intimate. I couldn't catch the words, but something about the way she spoke stopped me in my tracks. Instinctively, I listened. "You know I can't talk right now," she said quietly. "Yeah, I'll see you soon. I miss you, too." "Miss you?" The words hit me hard, like a punch to the gut, though I wasn't sure why. It could have been anyone on the other end, her sister, maybe a friend from work. But the way she spoke, that soft tone I hadn't heard from her in a while, sent a shiver down my spine. I slowly backed away, careful not to make any noise, and headed back downstairs, my mind racing. Bits and pieces of the past few weeks started coming together, but they didn't quite fit. She'd been working late a lot recently, with meetings that seemed to stretch into the night. That wasn't too unusual. Emily had always been dedicated to her career. But lately, she seemed distant, distracted even. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I was reading too much into it. I went back to the kitchen and started unpacking the groceries, my hands moving automatically while my brain was stuck in overdrive, playing out 100 different scenarios. By the time I'd put the last of the produce away, I heard footsteps on the stairs. "David!" Emily called out, her voice light and casual like everything was perfectly normal. "I didn't hear you come in. When did you get home?" "Just now," I answered, keeping my voice even. I turned to face her as she entered the kitchen, looking effortlessly beautiful in a fitted black blouse and jeans. She was smiling, but there was something about her eyes, something off. Like she was holding back. She walked over and gave me a quick peck on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late. Crazy day at the office," she said as she crossed to the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water without even glancing at the groceries I had just put away. She was already pulling away, slipping back into that familiar place of distraction that I had noticed creeping in over the past few months. "Everything all right at work?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, just testing the waters. "Yeah, just busy, you know," she said, waving her hand dismissively and taking a sip of water like it wasn't worth discussing. "How are the kids? Lucas at the gym again?" "Yeah, he'll be back later. Mia's out with her friends." Emily nodded absent-mindedly, her gaze drifting toward her phone on the counter. She hadn't said a word about who she was talking to upstairs, and I wasn't about to ask, at least, not yet. Instead, I tried to keep things light. "Maybe we could have dinner together tonight. It feels like it's been a while." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was thin, almost forced. "Sure, but I've got a couple of calls I need to make. You know how it is. Work never really stops." Her eyes flicked back to her phone, and there was something in that look that just didn't sit right with me. As the evening wore on, that nagging feeling in my gut only got worse. Dinner came and went with barely any conversation. Emily excused herself early, saying she had some work to finish up. I let it slide, trying to convince myself I was reading too much into things. But just before she headed upstairs again, I noticed her phone light up. A message flashed across the screen for a brief second, long enough for me to see a heart emoji. I couldn't catch the name. Under the table, my fists clenched. I had to know what was going on. Maybe it was nothing, but my instincts were screaming at me that it was something. After cleaning up the kitchen and finishing the dishes, I headed out to the garage, needing a little space to clear my head. Lucas would be home soon, and the last thing I wanted was for him to pick up on anything unusual. I fired up the old Camaro I'd been tinkering with, hoping the roar of that engine would settle my nerves. But even the rumble of 450 horsepower couldn't drown out the questions swirling in my mind. An hour later, I was back inside, scrolling through work emails, when I heard Emily's voice again. This time, it wasn't soft or secretive, it was sharp, almost angry. "I told you, I can't do this right now." "Yes, later." "No, I'll think of something." I moved quietly toward the hallway, careful to stay out of sight. The door to her office was cracked open just enough for me to see her pacing, phone pressed against her ear, tension visible in every step she took. Whatever conversation she was having, it sure didn't sound like work. She ended the call abruptly, and for a moment, I considered barging in and demanding answers. But I stopped myself. Not yet. There was more to this, and if I confronted her without solid proof, it'd just turn into a messy argument. No, I needed to be smart about this. Watch, wait, gather information. That night, the house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I hardly slept, the weight of suspicion keeping me wide awake. Something had shifted, and no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, I knew I couldn't. By morning, I realized I couldn't keep brushing it off. Too many things weren't adding up, and I had to prepare myself for whatever might come next. 3 days had passed since I overheard that conversation, but the tension in the house was like a storm building, just waiting to break. I kept my distance, observing her, searching for any sign that might confirm my suspicions. She hadn't said anything, and there was no effort on her part to close the growing distance between us. That Friday, I decided to come home earlier than usual, hoping to catch her off guard. No meetings, no pressing work, so I left the office early, taking the scenic route home to calm the knot of anxiety twisting in my chest. As I pulled into the driveway, Emily's car was already parked neatly, no rush this time. I got out of my truck, but the cool mountain air did nothing to lift the heaviness that had settled inside me. As soon as I walked through the front door, I could sense that something wasn't right. The house was quiet again, too quiet, and the kids were nowhere to be seen. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and stood there, listening for any signs of movement. Then I heard it, the faint sound of heels clicking against the upstairs floorboards. I made my way toward the stairs, taking each step slowly and deliberately. When I reached the top, I heard her humming softly from behind our bedroom door. I pushed it open just a crack, enough to see without being noticed. Emily was standing in front of the full-length mirror, her back to me. She was halfway through slipping into a black dress that hugged her body in a way that made its purpose clear. Her hair was pinned up, with a few loose strands falling around her neck in that effortless way. On the bed next to her lay a pair of 6-inch heels, ones I'd only seen her wear a handful of times before. Her movements were almost mechanical, like she'd done this 100 times. She adjusted her lipstick in quick, confident strokes, the kind of motion that comes with practice. She wasn't getting ready for me, that much was obvious. I pushed the door open wider and stepped into the room. "Where are you going?" She froze for a brief second, the lipstick pausing at her lips before she smoothly finished applying it. She capped it, set it on the dresser, and turned around, her expression calm, as if she had her answer ready. "Out," she said, her voice steady, almost too calm. "Out where?" I asked, stepping closer, my eyes locked on hers. She didn't flinch, didn't show even the slightest sign of guilt or hesitation. Instead, she brushed past me toward the bed, picking up her heels and slipping them on with practiced ease. "I'm going out for a bit," she replied, dismissively, as if that explained everything. "Just a night out?" I repeated, feeling the irritation rise inside me. "And in that?" She shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Yes, in this." "It's not a big deal, David. I need this." Her voice had changed, a hardness creeping in, something defensive. But I wasn't going to let it go this time. "And where exactly do you need to go, dressed like that?" I pressed, stepping in front of her, blocking her way to the door. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to the door behind me before meeting mine again. For a second, I thought she might try to lie, maybe throw out some excuse about meeting friends or going to a work event. But she didn't. Instead, she dropped the act entirely, crossing her arms over her chest like she was ready for a fight. "I'm going on a date," she said, bluntly, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "A date?" My voice came out low and cold. I stepped closer, forcing her to look at me. "You're married, Emily." "I'm aware," she replied, her tone almost mocking. "I just need this, okay? Just one night, that's all. I've been feeling restless." "Restless?" I repeated, trying to wrap my head around the audacity of what she was saying. "And this date, who is he?" "Ryan," she answered without missing a beat. "You don't know him." "He's someone I met through work." "He's younger," I finished for her, already knowing where this was headed. "Some younger guy, probably thrilled to boost his ego by having an affair with a married woman." Emily didn't even deny it. "Yeah, he's younger," she admitted, like it was some kind of accomplishment. "But it doesn't mean anything, David. It's just one night. I need this." I stared at her for a long moment, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman standing in front of me didn't even feel like the Emily I knew. How had it come to this? How had we gone from raising kids, building a life together, to standing at the edge of this? "If you walk out that door, it won't just be for one night, Emily," I warned, keeping my voice steady but firm. "This marriage won't just snap back to normal. You're throwing everything away." She smirked, shaking her head as if I was the one being unreasonable. "You're being dramatic," she replied. "I'm not throwing anything away. I love you, but I just need to feel, I don't know, alive again. This isn't going to change anything. We'll still be us." "No, Emily, we won't," I shot back. My words seemed to land, as I saw a flicker of doubt cross her eyes, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. She'd already made up her mind. Her eyes hardened again, and she spoke coolly. "You'll get over it. I'll be back tomorrow, and this will all blow over. You just need to let me have this." She stepped forward, trying to move past me, but I didn't budge. "I mean it, Emily," I said, my voice low and steady. "If you walk out that door, there's no coming back from this." She stared at me, her lips twitching with a mix of frustration and arrogance. "Don't be ridiculous, David. This doesn't have to be a big deal. You're overreacting. One night won't change anything." "I'm not the one changing things," I fired back. "You are." She let out a frustrated sigh, glancing at the clock on the nightstand. Then, with a resigned shrug, she sidestepped me and headed for the door. "I'm leaving, David. I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll talk then. You'll see, everything will go back to normal." I didn't move. I just stood there, watching her grab her small clutch from the dresser, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. When she reached the doorway, she turned back one last time, her face a mix of defiance and confidence, like she believed she could bend reality to fit her choices. "Don't wait up," she said with a smirk, and then she was gone. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where she'd been moments ago, the door still swinging shut behind her. For a second, the house felt eerily still, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the anger I'd been holding back erupted. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a picture frame from the dresser, and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall, the glass shattering into pieces on the floor. I didn't care. Let her think I'd just sit around, waiting for her to stroll back in like nothing had changed. She was wrong. So wrong. The morning after Emily walked out, I was awake before dawn, my mind racing but resolute. If there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that the life I'd built, my home, my business, my family, was not going to crumble without a fight. I wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let disaster unfold. I took action. The kids were still asleep when I fired up my truck and headed downtown. Sam's office was on the 10th floor of a sleek, modern building overlooking the Boulder skyline. I parked, took a deep breath to steady myself, and walked inside. Sam wasn't just my lawyer, he was my best friend. We'd known each other since college, back when we were both broke, foolish, and full of ideas about taking on the world. Now he had his own law firm and a reputation for being a ruthless litigator in the courtroom. And right now, that was exactly what I needed. The receptionist didn't even glance up as I passed her desk. Sam had always told me to skip the formalities and come straight to his office. I pushed open the door to find him sitting behind a desk stacked with case files, his glasses balanced on the tip of his nose. "David," he greeted me, setting aside his papers and motioning for me to take a seat. "I was wondering when you'd come by. I didn't waste any time." "Emily's cheating." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Shit. When did you find out?" "Last night. She went out to meet him." "Some guy from her work," I said, leaning back in the chair and folding my arms. "She claims it's just one night, something she needs." Sam didn't look surprised. He was good at keeping that poker face of his. Leaning forward, he interlaced his fingers. "All right, let's get to work. You know the drill. Colorado's a no-fault divorce state. Her cheating won't change the settlement, but we can definitely use it as leverage for custody, especially if you're going for that." "I'm not losing my kids," I said firmly. "Whatever Emily thinks is going to happen, she's wrong. I'm going for full custody." Sam nodded, grabbing a legal pad from his desk. "Okay, first things first. We need to protect your assets. I'm assuming you haven't told her what you're planning yet?" "No," I replied. "She thinks I'm just going to sit around, waiting for her to come waltzing back into the house like nothing happened." "Good," Sam said, jotting something down on the pad. "You need to act fast. Start by transferring half of the funds from your joint accounts into a personal account. Legally, you're entitled to do that as long as you leave enough for her to access. I'll handle the paperwork today. Also, we'll get new credit cards in your name only. You don't want her running up debts that you'll be stuck paying for later. As Sam laid out the plan, I felt a sense of control slowly coming back. This was something I could manage, strategy and preparation. That was my strength, more than Emily ever gave me credit for. We'll also file for a temporary restraining order on the assets, Sam continued. That way, she won't be able to touch anything without your knowledge. You still have full control over your business accounts, right? Yeah, I said. She's never had a say in those. Good. We'll leave those alone for now. But remember, she could try to claim half during the settlement, so it might get messy. I'll do everything I can to get you the best deal, but things will likely get ugly, especially if her parents get involved. I groaned at the thought. John and Nancy were the last people I wanted to deal with. Nancy was always the quiet manipulator, whispering doubts into Emily's ear, while John played the part of the overprotective father. They'd never liked me, and I wasn't expecting any help from them now. I'll be ready for that, I said. Sam scribbled more notes before looking up at me seriously. David, you need to be prepared. Emily's going to play the victim here, and her parents will back her up. They'll try to paint a picture that you pushed her into this. It won't matter that she's the one who cheated. I don't care what kind of story they try to spin, I said, my voice steady. I'm not going to let them twist this around. She made her choices, and I'm not going to act like any of this is my fault. Sam nodded approvingly. Good. Now, are you ready to move forward today? Once we start this process, there's no going back. I'm ready. The rest of the day moved quickly. After leaving Sam's office, I headed straight to the bank. The teller didn't even blink as I transferred half of the money from our savings and checking accounts into a new one under my name. I watched the numbers shift on the screen, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. Emily wouldn't notice right away, but when she did, she'd know I wasn't sitting idly by. Next, I called the credit card companies. I canceled every joint card we had and applied for new ones in my name only. Each task felt like a small victory, another step toward taking control of the situation. This wasn't just about the money, it was about showing her that she couldn't just have her fling and come back to the same life. She had no idea what was coming. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was mid-afternoon. Lucas's car was already there, and I could hear music thumping from his room upstairs. I headed to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and sank into a chair at the kitchen table, taking a deep breath. Eventually, I'd have to tell the kids what was happening, but now wasn't the time. Not until I had everything lined up. I hadn't even finished half of my beer when the doorbell rang. Opening the door, I found my parents standing on the porch, Mom clutching her purse like it was a lifeline, and Dad looking like he'd been dragged along unwillingly. David, Mom said, her voice tight with barely contained worry, can we come in? I stepped aside, and they walked into the living room. Once they sat down, I could feel the tension radiating from my mother. She fidgeted with the strap of her purse, her eyes scanning the room as if trying to find the right words. We need to talk, she began, her voice low but steady. I knew what was coming. Let me guess, Emily called you. Mom nodded, biting her lip. She's upset, David. She says you're overreacting, that you're threatening to throw everything away over a misunderstanding. I let out a bitter laugh. A misunderstanding? Is that what she's calling it now? Dad, who had been quiet until this point, finally spoke up. Son, we know things have been tough. But divorce? You need to think about the family, the kids. You don't want to do something you'll regret. Leaning back in my chair, I crossed my arms. Dad, she's cheating on me. I heard it with my own ears. I watched her get dressed and walk out the door to meet another man. This isn't some misunderstanding. Mom's eyes widened slightly, but she kept her tone calm. David, you've been under a lot of stress, running the business, taking care of the house. Maybe Emily made a mistake, but you can work through this. She says she still loves you. That's not love, I replied, my voice cold. She's trying to make a fool out of me. I'm not going to sit here while she walks all over me. You're being too rigid, Mom pleaded. Marriage is hard. People make mistakes, but you've built a life together. Are you really willing to throw all of that away over one night? I stood up, pacing the room, struggling to keep my frustration in check. It's not just one night, Mom. She's been lying to me for months. Do you really think we can just sweep that under the rug? Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, we're not saying it's easy, but divorce, it's messy. The kids will be stuck in the middle, and you know how Nancy and John are. They'll twist this around and make it look like you forced her hand. Do you really want to go down that road? I stopped pacing and looked directly at them. I've already started the process. I'm not changing my mind. Mom's face fell, and she shook her head. David, please. I'm done, I said firmly. She's made her choice, and now I'm making mine. They left shortly after that, my mom still mumbling about family and reconciliation, but I wasn't going to be swayed. I had drawn my line, and I wasn't backing down. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Sam called. He'd already filed the paperwork for the asset protection and the restraining order. Things were moving fast, just the way I needed them to. Then came the text from Emily, "We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "We'll talk. But this time, I'm done pretending." I knew that conversation was inevitable. From the second I saw that text, I realized this wasn't going to be just between the two of us anymore. Days had passed since I started making moves, freezing accounts and preparing for the inevitable fallout. Emily wasn't going to sit idly by. She had weapons of her own. And those weapons were Lucas and Mia. I was out in the garage, the one place I could usually clear my head. The Camaro's hood was propped open, and I was elbow-deep in the engine, trying to drown my thoughts in the rhythm of the work. But today, even the comforting mechanics couldn't quiet my mind. No matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept drifting back to Emily, her smug smile as she walked out the door, and to the kids, who had been unusually quiet lately. The silence in the house felt thick, like it was holding something back. I heard the creak of the door opening, followed by heavy footsteps and then lighter ones. Lucas's voice broke the stillness in the garage. "Dad, we need to talk." I didn't turn around right away. Instead, I wiped the grease off my hands and took a deep breath before facing them. Lucas stood by the garage door, arms crossed, looking more like a man than a teenager in that moment. Behind him, Mia stood nervously biting her lip, her eyes flicking between her brother and me. It felt like they had rehearsed this, preparing for an ambush. I nodded, tossing the rag onto the workbench. "All right, let's talk." Lucas didn't waste any time. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. He threw his hands up, frustration spilling over. "Everything. Freezing the accounts, shutting Mom out, trying to take everything from her. She told us you're punishing her for one mistake. Is that true?" There it was, Emily had gotten to them first, just like I knew she would. She'd twisted the narrative, making herself the victim. I could almost hear her voice in my head, the same tone she probably used at work when she was manipulating people, calm, convincing, always knowing exactly which buttons to push. I stepped closer to them, my voice steady. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Mia's voice was softer, more like a plea than an accusation. She stepped forward, hugging her arms around herself as if bracing for impact. "Mom says you don't care about the family anymore, that you're just trying to get back at her." Their words weighed heavily on me, but I kept my composure. "This isn't about revenge. Your mom and I, things haven't been right for a while. She made choices, and now I have to make mine. Lucas's jaw tightened, and I could see his fists clenching at his sides. So what? You're just going to blow everything up because she messed up once? I looked at him closely. My son, the boy I'd taught to fix cars, the kid I spent hours with in this very garage, working side by side. But he wasn't a boy anymore. He was angry. Angry and hurt. And Emily had stoked that anger with her version of the truth. Lucas, it's not that simple, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Yes, it is, he shot back, stepping closer. You're making this into something way bigger than it needs to be. Mom said it was just one night. One mistake. You're overreacting, you're ruining the family. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't let it show. I'd expected this confrontation. Maybe not so soon, but I knew it was coming. There was no choice but to push through it. This isn't about one night, Lucas. It's been going on for months. She's been lying to me, to all of us. This isn't just one mistake, it's a pattern. Mia's eyes widened, and she looked at Lucas as if seeking confirmation. For a split second, Lucas's expression wavered, but then it hardened again. Even if that's true, she's still our mom. You don't have to tear the family apart because of it. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I'm not trying to tear anything apart. I'm trying to protect what's left, I said, keeping my voice steady. Your mom's the one who walked out, not me. She didn't walk out on us, Mia replied, her voice trembling. She just needed a break. She's been under so much stress, and she told us you've been distant, that you don't care about her anymore. The narrative Emily had fed them was clear as day. She had cast herself as the overworked, underappreciated wife, while I was the cold, detached husband. Classic. I looked down at the floor, biting back my frustration. Arguing with them wasn't going to get us anywhere. Listen, I said, meeting their eyes again, I know this is hard to understand, and I'm not asking you to pick sides. But there are things happening between your mom and me that you don't know about, things you shouldn't know about. But I promise you, I'm doing what I think is right for all of us. Lucas shook his head, his face twisted in anger. No, you're doing what's right for you. You're pissed off, and you just want to hurt her. That's all this is. I'm not trying to hurt her, I said quietly. I'm trying to protect myself. And protect you. From what? Mia asked, her voice small and scared. Mom said you're taking everything away. She said you're trying to take the house, the money. Is that true? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. The house? Yeah, I'm fighting for it. And the money? I'm making sure your mom doesn't spend it all while we figure this out. It's not about taking things from her. It's about making sure we don't lose everything. Lucas scoffed and turned away, pacing the garage like a caged animal. You sound just like a lawyer. Jesus, Dad, why can't you just let it go? Why can't you just fix things? Mia was still looking at me, her eyes wide, filled with a mix of fear and confusion. I wanted to reach out, to explain it in a way that would make sense, but I knew there wasn't any way to do that without sounding like I was defending myself. And the last thing I wanted was to plead for their understanding, not when they were already so wrapped up in Emily's side of the story. Lucas stopped pacing and turned to face me again. You're breaking us, Dad. You're the one doing this, not her. The words hit like a slap, but I held my ground. I straightened my shoulders and looked him in the eye. I'm not breaking us, Lucas. I'm doing what I have to do to protect myself and protect you both. When you're older, you'll understand. Understand what? Lucas snapped. That you care more about money and your pride than you do about your family? Lucas. No, Dad, this is crap. His voice cracked with frustration, boiling over. Mom told us everything. She said you've been checked out for months. That you've been treating her like a roommate, not a wife. And now you're making her the villain just because she made a mistake. How's that fair? Mia was crying now, her hands covering her face. Lucas stood there shaking, his fists still clenched at his sides. Both of them were staring at me, waiting for something, some explanation that would make sense of all this. But I didn't have one. At least, not one they'd accept. Look, I said, my voice softer now. I'm not asking you to pick sides. But this isn't just about one mistake. There's more to it. I'm sorry you're caught in the middle, but I can't let this go. Lucas shook his head, his eyes filled with disappointment. Yeah, I figured. He turned to leave, and Mia followed behind him, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her hoodie. I watched them walk out, the weight of the conversation pressing heavily on my shoulders. The door slammed behind them, and I was left standing alone in the garage, the silence even louder than before. For the first time since all of this started, I felt something close to despair creeping in. I had known Emily would twist the kids' minds, but hearing their accusations and seeing the anger and hurt in their eyes was far worse than anything I could have imagined. I stood there in the garage for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space where my kids had just been, knowing I hadn't gotten through to them. Not yet, anyway. They were too caught in her web, too blinded by her version of the story. The courthouse had that cold, sterile atmosphere that crept into your bones, the kind of place where it was painfully clear that no good came from being there. It was a gray, overcast morning, the clouds hanging low over Boulder, and inside the building, the air felt even heavier. I'd been to court before, for business disputes, zoning issues, but never for something like this. Never with so much on the line. I sat beside Sam in the courtroom, my eyes flicking toward the heavy wooden doors every few seconds. Emily hadn't shown up yet, but her lawyer, Rebecca, had. She was one of those people who made sure every detail of her appearance was flawless, meticulous and sharp, just like her reputation. Her red blazer stood out starkly against the dullness of the room, and even when she wasn't looking directly at me, I could feel her presence, her gaze cutting through the air. Sam leaned in close, speaking in a low voice. She's going to come at you hard today. Expect the narrative to shift quickly. I nodded. I'm ready. At least, I thought I was. I'd played this scene out in my head 1,000 times since we filed the papers. Emily was going to play the victim, of course she was. She'd paint me as cold, distant, emotionally unavailable. Maybe she'd claim I was too focused on work or that I'd been too strict with the kids. I wasn't naive about what was coming. But knowing it was inevitable didn't make it any easier. It didn't take the sting out of the betrayal. The creak of the courtroom door pulled me from my thoughts, and there she was, Emily, walking in like she was attending some important business meeting. She looked perfect, as always, dressed in a sleek gray dress that screamed composure and control. Behind her, like loyal foot soldiers, were her parents, John and Nancy. Their faces were already set in hard, disapproving lines. They'd never liked me, and now they had more than enough fuel to stoke the flames. My own parents sat a few rows behind me, looking equally uncomfortable. They hadn't said much when I picked them up that morning, but I already knew how they felt. Mom had made it clear on the phone the night before, she thought I should settle. For the sake of the kids, she had said. My dad wasn't as vocal, but he'd nodded in agreement. They didn't want to see me dragged through the mud or the children caught in the middle. But I couldn't just give in, not after everything Emily had done. The judge entered, a stern-faced woman who looked like she didn't have time for nonsense, and the proceedings began. Rebecca was the first to speak. She took her time, carefully adjusting her papers before confidently walking toward the bench to begin her opening statement. Your Honor, this case is not simply about a marriage falling apart. It's about a woman who was left isolated, unsupported, and emotionally abandoned by her husband. Yes, Emily made a mistake, but it was a mistake born from years of neglect. Her husband, David, became distant, controlling, and fixated on his work and his pride. He emotionally shut her out, and when she reached her breaking point, she made a regrettable decision. But that doesn't mean she deserves to be vilified. I could feel my jaw clenching as Rebecca spoke. She was good. Really good. She painted Emily as the sympathetic figure, a woman backed into a corner, making a single poor choice after years of being emotionally isolated. It was all part of their plan, and I knew that, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. And now, Rebecca said, turning slightly to face me, David is trying to punish her. He's seeking full custody of their children, freezing accounts, and using his financial leverage to control the narrative. He's willing to tear this family apart, all because he refuses to forgive a single mistake. I could practically feel my mother shift in the seat behind me, the weight of her disapproval pressing down like a heavy cloud. They wanted me to settle. Emily's parents had already managed to turn the kids against me, and now my own parents were pushing me to back down too. It was almost too much, but I knew I had to hold my ground. When Rebecca finally finished, Sam rose calmly, adjusting his jacket as he approached the bench. His voice was measured, steady, exactly what I needed to hear right then. Your Honor, we're going to hear a lot today about emotional abandonment and isolation. But what we won't hear from the other side is the truth about the events that led us here. My client, David, isn't seeking revenge. He's simply trying to protect himself and his children from further harm. What Emily refers to as a single mistake is actually part of a series of deliberate choices. Choices made to deceive her family, to deceive David, and ultimately to place her own desires above the well-being of her children. Sam's words were like a lifeline, steadying me. I always knew he was good at what he did, but hearing him calmly dismantle Rebecca's narrative felt like regaining ground in a battle I never wanted to fight in the first place. As we proceed, Sam continued, we'll present evidence that contradicts the version of events being told by Emily's side. This isn't about one isolated incident. It's about a consistent pattern of behavior that simply cannot be ignored. Sam's confidence radiated through the courtroom, and for the first time that day, I felt a bit of the tension in my chest begin to ease. After the opening statements, things moved quickly. Rebecca began calling witnesses, starting with John and Nancy. Predictably, they rallied behind their daughter, insisting that Emily had been unhappy for years and that I had been too controlling. Nancy, with her calculated, quiet tone, painted a picture of me suffocating Emily, never giving her the space she needed. I sat there, teeth clenched, forcing myself to stay composed. This was just the beginning. When Rebecca called Emily to the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to shift its focus to her, as if she were playing the part of some tragic heroine. And she played it well, her voice trembling just enough to seem sincere. She admitted to the affair, but wrapped it in layers of excuses. She spoke of the pressures of raising two teenagers, the long hours at work, and how I had grown distant. I didn't plan for this to happen, she said, looking directly at the judge. It just happened. I felt lost, and I made a mistake. I regret it every day, but I'm still their mother. I love my children, and I just want what's best for them. This doesn't have to tear us apart. Sam didn't let her off the hook when it was his turn. He pressed her on the months of lies, the nights she came home late, the deception she'd fed me and the kids. She stumbled over her words a few times, but Rebecca quickly objected whenever Sam got too close to exposing the truth, Emily's selfishness. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Sam stood and called his next witness. Your Honor, we'd like to call Alex Mitchell to the stand. I watched Emily's face as Alex walked into the courtroom. She stiffened, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Alex looked nervous, and he had every reason to be. He wasn't here by choice, he had been subpoenaed. And now, under oath, he was about to become a real problem for Emily. Alex took the stand, and Sam didn't waste any time. Mr. Mitchell, how long have you been involved with Emily? Alex glanced nervously at Rebecca, who shot him a warning look. About 6 months, he mumbled. Sam nodded. And during that time, did Emily ever mention her marriage? Her family? Alex swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Rebecca before answering. Yeah, she said things weren't good at home. That her husband was always working, didn't care about her anymore. And how many times did you and Emily meet outside of work? Sam pressed him. Alex hesitated, then mumbled, a few. More than a few, Mr. Mitchell, Sam continued, his tone firm. Alex's voice dropped even lower, barely above a whisper. Yes. How many? Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. I don't know. Maybe 10. 15. I saw the judge's eyebrows raise slightly, and Rebecca shot up from her seat, already objecting. But the damage was done. Sam had made his point loud and clear. It wasn't just a one-time mistake, as Emily had claimed. This had been a long, calculated string of betrayals. And Alex, under oath, had just confirmed it. By the time we left the courthouse that afternoon, I could feel the change in the air. Emily's parents were huddled close to her outside, whispering furiously, their faces tight with worry. My own parents stood off to the side, silent and tense. They hadn't said much after the hearing, but their disappointment hung in the air like a thick fog. I could sense their wish for me to make peace, to find a way to end this quietly. But peace wasn't an option anymore. Not after what had come out today. I walked over to Sam, who was already deep in thought, mapping out the next steps in his head. This is far from over, he said quietly, his voice steady. But we're gaining ground. I nodded, my eyes locking on Emily across the parking lot. She stood there, staring back at me, her face pale but her eyes still holding that familiar defiance. This war wasn't over, but I wasn't about to back down. By the time we entered the second round of court proceedings, all gloves were off. It wasn't just about who did what anymore, it had turned into a tactical game, a battle of who could dismantle the other's case with more precision. And I was ready. The weeks leading up to that day had been a whirlwind of late-night strategy meetings with Sam and relentless moments of doubt gnawing at the edges of my mind. I had spent countless hours piecing things together, tracking every inconsistency in Emily's story, every suspicious expense, every thread that didn't add up. This wasn't just about her affair anymore. It was about the lies, the deceit, and, now, the money. Sam and I had been meticulous. We couldn't rely solely on Alex's shaky testimony, not if we wanted a solid win. Emily was too clever for that. She'd find a way to twist his words, downplay the affair, make it seem less damaging than it was. No, I needed something stronger, something irrefutable. Something she couldn't spin or explain away. That's when I started digging deeper. I spent hours poring over our bank statements, cross-referencing every transaction from our joint accounts. Emily had always handled the day-to-day finances, but I had kept an eye on the big picture. It didn't take long to find the first crack in her story. There were payments I didn't recognize, charges for hotels, restaurants, flights. At first glance, they didn't seem suspicious, just part of her work routine, meetings with clients, team dinners. But the dates matched up too perfectly with the nights she claimed to be working late. It wasn't enough, though. I needed something undeniable, something that would make her lies crumble in front of everyone. That's when I remembered the cameras. I hadn't thought much about them at first. They were small security cameras I'd installed months ago, mostly for peace of mind. The kind you forget about because they blend into the background, silently recording everything. I'd set them up in the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway leading to the front door. But I hadn't checked the footage in ages. When I finally sat down to review the recordings, my heart raced. I hadn't expected to find much, maybe a few stray conversations, something I could use to show how erratic her behavior had become. But what I uncovered was far worse. Far more damning. There she was, Emily, sitting on the couch in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, talking on the phone with one of her friends. And she didn't hold back. She laughed, she joked, and she mocked me. She called me clueless and boring, said she hadn't felt this alive in years, not since she'd been with Alex. Then she bragged about how easy it had been to fool me. How men like me never see it coming. And that wasn't all. She casually mentioned a trip she and Alex had taken to Palm Springs, a trip I knew nothing about, funded by our joint account. She was too drunk and too comfortable to realize the danger of what she was saying. It was like striking gold. Now, sitting in the courtroom, I waited for the perfect moment. Sam had the footage queued up, and I could feel the tension in the room building as we prepared to play it. Rebecca had no clue what was coming. I hadn't said a word about the camera, hadn't even hinted that I had something this damning ready to go. The element of surprise was everything. Rebecca was in the middle of another long-winded speech, painting Emily as a woman driven by desperation. She talked about the pressures of motherhood and how having a distant, emotionally unavailable husband had led Emily to make mistakes she now regretted. Emily sat beside her, looking calm and composed, like this was just another day at the office. She wasn't nervous. She thought she had already won the kids over, and in her mind, that was the ultimate victory. Then Sam stood up. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm but steady, "we have new evidence that sheds light on the true nature of this case." The judge, who had remained mostly impassive during Rebecca's argument, glanced up with a hint of curiosity. "Proceed." Sam gestured toward the screen set up across from the bench. "We have footage from inside the Dawson home, where Emily speaks candidly about her relationship with Alex Mitchell, the extent of her deception, and her misuse of joint finances during the course of their marriage." I didn't miss the way Rebecca's eyes narrowed when Sam mentioned the footage. "But Emily?" She looked momentarily confused. She had no idea I'd installed cameras. "I never told her." Sam pressed play. The room filled with the unmistakable sound of Emily's voice. She was laughing, her words dripping with arrogance as she recounted her trips with Alex, admitting openly that she had used our money to fund their getaways. Her voice echoed through the silent courtroom, mocking me as she described how clueless I had been. "I mean, I love David," she said, swirling her wine, "but he's so clueless sometimes. He doesn't even notice when I'm gone. And Alex makes me feel young again. Palm Springs was amazing." Emily's face went pale as the footage continued, her confidence crumbling with every word. Her mockery, her boasts about how easy it was to fool me, all laid bare for the court to hear. She lowered her gaze to the table, her composure unraveling as Rebecca leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear. But there was no stopping it now. The damage was done. Sam didn't need to say much after that. The footage spoke for itself. It was clear Emily's so-called mistake wasn't an isolated incident, it was a calculated betrayal that had spanned months, funded by the money we had earned together. When the video ended, Sam turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this is not the behavior of a remorseful spouse. This is the behavior of someone who deliberately chose to deceive her husband, misuse their joint finances, and mock the foundation of their marriage. We believe this evidence should heavily influence the division of assets and the custody arrangement." The judge's face was unreadable, but I could see she was listening, really listening. The tide was turning. For the first time, Emily was on the defensive, and the cracks in her armor were starting to show. After court recessed for the day, I stepped outside, needing some air. The weight of everything still pressed down on me, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. I had exposed Emily for who she truly was, and it felt like I finally had some traction in this battle. I didn't get far before I heard a voice call out from behind me. "David." I turned to see Emily standing just a few feet away. Her face was no longer composed. Instead, it was a mix of anger and desperation, her perfect facade finally shattered. "You really had to do that in front of everyone?" Emily hissed, her voice low but sharp. You couldn't have just talked to me. You had to humiliate me. I stood there, her accusation hanging heavy in the air between us. You humiliated yourself, Emily. You did this to us. Not me. She scoffed, shaking her head, her anger palpable. You don't get it. You've never understood. Maybe I don't, I admitted, my voice firm. But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about everything, the lies, the money, the kids. You threw it all away. Her eyes flickered, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. You think you've won, don't you? I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a low, controlled tone. No, Emily. Nobody wins in this. But I'm done letting you walk all over me. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there alone, the storm between us still raging. But this time, I held the upper hand. Later that evening, Sam called with more good news. He'd just received word that Emily's financial records had uncovered even more misuse of our funds, vacations, dinners, shopping sprees, all hidden within our joint accounts. It wasn't just Palm Springs. She and Alex had been using my money for their personal indulgences, solidifying our case even further. The next time we went to court, I'd be ready. I had the proof, the leverage, and now the momentum. The air in the courtroom felt thick, each moment stretching out like time itself had slowed just to make me feel the weight of it all. Sam sat beside me, quietly reviewing his notes as we braced ourselves for the final round in this war. But no amount of preparation could settle the storm churning inside me. This was it, the day everything came to a head. The custody battle. The thing that had kept me awake more than anything else. Emily sat across the room, calm and composed as ever, her mask firmly in place. Lucas and Mia weren't there yet, they'd be brought in later. For now, it was just us, the lawyers, and the judge. I could feel my parents' eyes on me from their seats in the gallery. My mother had barely spoken to me that morning, and my father's face was etched with quiet tension. I knew what they wanted, peace, a settlement. But that wasn't happening. Not after everything Emily had done. Not after what had come to light. On the opposite side, Emily's parents sat like they were preparing for a funeral. John's jaw was set, his disapproval written all over his face. And Nancy, well, she was always 2 steps ahead, her calculating expression ready to twist the knife if necessary. The tension broke when the judge called the court to order. Today we'll be discussing custody arrangements, she began, her voice cool and professional. I want to remind both parties that the court's primary concern is the best interest of the children. Best interest. Those words had weighed heavily on me since the start of this whole ordeal. What was best for Lucas and Mia? I knew one thing for certain, it wasn't living under Emily's roof, being spoon-fed lies, growing up in the toxic environment she had created. But knowing that and proving it were 2 different things. Rebecca stood to give her opening argument, every word carefully chosen, each syllable crafted to paint Emily as the perfect mother, the steady hand in the children's lives. She framed it perfectly, emphasizing how Emily had always been the one to guide the kids through school, manage their activities, and attend their events. She pointed out my supposed emotional distance, painting a picture of a father too focused on his business to see his family crumbling. I sat there, jaw clenched, knowing that in some ways, she wasn't entirely wrong. I had worked hard, maybe too hard at times. I'd put in long hours to provide for my family, to build something solid that could support us. But that didn't make me a bad father. It didn't erase everything I'd done for Lucas and Mia. And it sure as hell didn't excuse what Emily had done. When Rebecca finished, Sam stood, buttoning his jacket as he approached the bench. His voice was steady and calm, no theatrics needed. He had the facts on his side. Your Honor, we've already seen evidence of Emily's deceit, her multiple affairs, her financial mismanagement. This is not the behavior of a mother who puts her children first. It's the behavior of someone who has chosen to prioritize her own desires over the well-being of her family. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. My client, David, has been consistent in his dedication to his children. Yes, he works hard, but he has always provided a stable, loving environment. The claims that he is emotionally unavailable are simply distractions from the real issue, Emily's repeated betrayal, not just as a wife, but as a mother. Sam's words were strong, but I could feel the pressure of the day weighing down on me. This wasn't just a legal game anymore. This was personal, and we both knew it. I glanced over at Emily. For the first time, I could see the cracks in her calm exterior, her fingers nervously tapping on the table, her jaw clenched just a little too tightly. The kids were brought in shortly after, escorted by a court-appointed representative. Lucas walked in first, his face set with that same defiant expression he'd worn in the garage weeks ago. Mia trailed behind him, eyes downcast, avoiding my gaze. The ache in my chest grew sharper, but I forced myself to remain steady. I had to. This wasn't the time to crumble. The judge addressed them directly, asking about their lives, their routines, and how they felt about the situation. Lucas spoke first, and he didn't hold back. I want to stay with Mom, he said firmly, his voice loud and clear. Dad's been distant for a long time. He doesn't get it. Mom understands us. She's always there. I don't want things to change. The judge nodded, taking notes, then turned to Mia. I watched her carefully, hoping for something, anything, that might give me a sign. But when she finally spoke, her voice was small, uncertain. I don't know, she murmured. I just want everything to go back to the way it was. That hit harder than I'd expected. The way it was? There was no going back to that. Not after everything that had been uncovered. But in her mind, she still wanted to believe things could somehow return to some version of normal. She didn't understand how deep the fracture ran. The judge thanked them and allowed them to leave. As they walked out, Lucas shot me a glare full of anger. But Mia. Mia paused at the door, glancing back at me with something in her eyes that looked like guilt. It was small, but I saw it. It wasn't over yet. Then came the unexpected turn. As we reached the point for final arguments, Sam leaned in and whispered, "We're about to pull the ace." He nodded slightly toward Mia, and I didn't fully understand what he meant until he stood and called her back to the stand. Mia looked confused, hesitant, as she walked back into the courtroom and took her place in the witness chair. Sam approached her carefully, his voice soft but direct. "Mia, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with the court. Do you remember any conversations between your mom and her friends? Conversations about other people, besides Alex?" Mia's brow furrowed, her eyes darting nervously toward Emily. But then, slowly, she nodded. "Yeah, I remember." Sam leaned in slightly. "What did your mom say?" She said something about another guy. She was laughing with her friend about how she had gone out with him too. It was when she was still with Alex. The courtroom fell dead silent. Emily's face drained of color, and Rebecca's lips tightened as she muttered something under her breath. Sam remained calm, his tone neutral but firm. "So, it wasn't just about Alex, was it?" Mia hesitated, clearly torn, but after a moment, she shook her head. "No, I guess not." And that was it. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Emily hadn't just had one affair, she had been juggling multiple. And now, her own daughter had unwittingly exposed the truth. Whispers and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Rebecca was already on her feet, trying to object, but the damage was done. Mia's accidental confession had shattered the last of Emily's carefully constructed facade. This wasn't about a midlife crisis or a single lapse in judgment, it was a pattern of deceit, and everyone in that room could see it. When the judge spoke again, her voice was calm but authoritative. I will be reviewing this testimony closely as I make my decision regarding custody and asset division. For now, court is adjourned. The gavel struck the bench, and just like that, it was over, at least for the day. The room emptied slowly, tension still thick in the air. Outside the courthouse, the weight of the day pressed down on me like a boulder. The legal battle was now tipping in my favor, but at what cost? Lucas still wouldn't even look at me. Mia, though she had inadvertently helped my case, was more confused than ever. And my parents? They were torn, caught between wanting to support me and worrying about what all this fighting was doing to the family. My mother approached me, her voice soft but heavy with concern. "David, maybe it's time to think about what's best for the kids." I turned to her, my patience fraying. What's best for the kids, Mom, is not living with someone who's been lying to them and cheating behind my back. Her expression tightened, but she pressed on. But dragging them through this, all this fighting, it's not going to help them either. I shook my head, frustration boiling up. What do you want me to do? Just give up. Let Emily have everything and walk away. I can't do that. I won't do that. She sighed, weariness etched deep in her eyes. We just don't want to see you lose them, David. Not like this. I knew what she meant. This wasn't just about winning in court, it was about winning back my kids. But after everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. As they walked away, the weight of it all settled deeper in my chest. Legally, I might come out on top, but with Lucas and Mia? That was another story. I stood there, watching as dark clouds gathered over the mountains, realizing the hardest part was still ahead. The day the divorce was finalized felt nothing like a victory. I sat in the courtroom, listening as the judge read the final verdict with the detached tone of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the worst in people. The words were clear, I had won. The family home, the bulk of our shared assets, enough leverage to secure my financial future. But as I stared at the papers in front of me, the reality of it all settled into my bones like a weight I hadn't expected. Emily didn't meet my eyes. She sat rigid in her chair, pale but composed, her mask still firmly in place. Humiliated but not broken, she still had her supporters. I could feel the glares from across the room, especially from Nancy, her gaze sharp and accusing, as if she were already plotting her next move, some new way to twist this mess into being my fault. They hadn't spoken to me since the last court session, but their silence screamed louder than any words ever could. The hardest part was that Lucas and Mia hadn't shown up today. I knew they wouldn't, but that didn't make their absence any easier to swallow. They'd made their choice, just like Emily had. I had held out some foolish hope that, maybe after everything had come out, they'd see the truth. But Emily had poisoned the well so deeply that I wasn't sure if they'd ever come back. They weren't even talking to me now, barely responding to my texts. Every time I reached out, Lucas would fire back with some short, angry reply, and Mia, she didn't respond at all. As the judge's gavel came down, signaling the end, I stood up slowly, the hollow echo of the courtroom reverberating in my ears. Sam packed up the papers beside me, his expression unreadable. He had fought hard for this, and legally, we'd won. But Sam knew me well enough to realize this wasn't the victory I'd hoped for. He glanced up, his voice low. You did what you had to do, David. Don't forget that. I nodded, but the words felt distant. Necessary or not, it didn't make the emptiness inside feel any smaller. Outside the courthouse, the world carried on like nothing had changed. People walked by, cars honked in the distance, and the usual hum of Boulder's midday traffic filled the streets. But for me, everything felt quieter, like the world had slowed down, leaving me standing still. Emily left without a word, her parents flanking her like loyal guards. Nancy didn't bother with a parting glance, but John hesitated. His eyes flicked toward me, carrying something like hesitation, or maybe pity. Either way, it didn't matter. They'd made their stance clear long ago. Sam walked with me to the parking lot, his voice professional as ever, though I could sense the sympathy beneath it. We've got the property secured. She has to vacate within 30 days. I'll have the papers sent tomorrow. I nodded, unlocking the truck, staring at the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. Sam paused, hand on the doorframe, waiting for me to say something. But I didn't have much left to say. Not right now. You did everything you could, he said, his tone softer this time. I know it feels like a loss, but you've got what you need to move forward. Yeah, I exhaled, forcing a breath. Moving forward. He gave me a firm pat on the shoulder. Call me if you need anything. We'll finalize the rest of the financial details next week. With that, he walked away, disappearing into the flow of people passing by. I sat in the truck for a while, just staring out at the parking lot, my mind fogged by everything that had happened over the past few months. Everyone kept telling me I'd won. I had the house, the assets. But all I could think about was the silence from Lucas and Mia, the gaping absence that now filled my life. The house felt different when I returned. I hadn't been back since Emily moved out a few weeks ago, but now it was officially mine again. It was too big for just me, though. Every room seemed to echo with memories I wasn't ready to face. Lucas's old soccer cleats still sat by the door. Mia's textbooks were neatly stacked on the dining room table, just where she'd left them before the storm hit. It felt eerie, like they were ghosts who had vanished, leaving only fragments of themselves behind. I wandered through the empty rooms, running my hand along the walls, the furniture. This had been my home, our home, and now it was just a hollow shell, a monument to everything that had gone wrong. I stopped in Lucas's room, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air. His posters were still tacked to the wall, and on his dresser sat a framed picture of the two of us working on the Camaro together. It hurt to look at that photo. I picked it up, staring at our faces, Lucas grinning, me focused on the engine we'd been tinkering with that summer. Back then, I thought those moments would last forever. I believed that despite all the struggles, we'd still be a family in the end. But I was wrong. Lucas didn't want to live with me now. He had made that painfully clear. And Mia? She was just as caught up in Emily's web. Days turned into weeks, and as the legal dust settled, I tried to pick up the pieces. The business kept me occupied, and for that, I was grateful. Work had always been my escape, and now, it was all I had left. The guys at the construction site could sense something was off, but they didn't pry. They weren't the type to dig into personal matters, and I preferred it that way. Sam stayed in touch, keeping me updated on the final financial details. We met at his office one afternoon to go over the last bits of paperwork. Emily's still trying to get her hands on some of the smaller accounts, Sam said, tapping the stack of documents on his desk, but we've got the bulk of it locked in your favor. You'll come out of this better off financially than most. Thanks, I muttered, glancing over the papers, but the numbers didn't mean much to me anymore. Sam studied me for a moment, then asked, "Have you talked to the kids?" I shook my head. Lucas still won't answer. And Mia? I don't know what to do. I've texted, called, even showed up at their school a few times, but they're just not interested. Sam sighed, leaning back in his chair. Give it time. They'll come around. Emily's got them tied up in her story right now, but eventually, they'll see through it. Maybe, I said, though doubt hung heavy in my voice. I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. The hardest part of all this wasn't just the kids. It was my parents. After everything came out in court and the rulings went in my favor, I thought maybe they'd understand why I fought so hard. But they didn't. My mother was the first to voice her disappointment. She called me a few days after the ruling, her voice weighed down with sadness. I just don't know if this was worth it, David, she said, her words cutting deeper than I'd expected. You've lost the kids. Emily's hurt, and now the family's in pieces. I tried to explain, to make her see that I hadn't had a choice, but she wouldn't hear it. She saw it as pride, as stubbornness. In her mind, I should have forgiven Emily, worked it out for the sake of Lucas and Mia. But that wasn't possible, not after everything Emily had done. My father stayed quieter, but his disapproval was just as loud. He didn't say much, but the looks, the strained silences when we were together, said enough. They didn't see things the way I did. And now, there was a rift between us that I wasn't sure could ever be mended. One evening, weeks after everything had settled, I found myself standing in the garage. The Camaro sat there, unfinished, a relic of better times. I hadn't touched it since Lucas stopped helping me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the engine, remembering how things used to be. My phone buzzed on the workbench. I reached for it, expecting another update from Sam, but instead, it was a text from Mia. "Hey, can we talk?" For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, not everything was lost. It would take time, more time than I'd ever imagined, but I was ready. I had the house, the business, and my dignity. But most importantly, I had survived.